Hi, how's it going? Now, normally on the monthly vlogs, I like to show something practical, something physical. It might be relating to a particular concept or idea, or maybe some sort of technique or exercise, but usually we're showing something. Today's going to be a little bit different because I'm just going to be talking. There's a particular subject I want to talk about, as you might have guessed from the title of the video, which is violence, particularly as it relates to martial arts. This is for a couple of reasons. There's a couple of things come up recently. One is on the member channel, we had a request to do work with the fingers. So of course that includes things like strengthening the grip, working on mobility and sensitivity of the fingers and so on, but also how to work against someone else's fingers, which can involve, of course, breaking them, because it's physically relatively easy if someone gives you their hands like that to work against and break the fingers. Well, that sparked a bit of a discussion with some of the members writing in and asking questions about that. Under what circumstances is it right to do that, for example? And again, as I said, physically, relatively straightforward, but psychologically, could you actually do that to someone? That was the first thing. Oh, and of course, by the way, if you do want to get access to the member channel, then click the join button below and that will give you the details of how you can get all the instructional content we're uploading. There's over 100 videos there now, I think, so it really is a valuable resource for any Systema practitioner. The second thing was one of the groups I'm a member of on Facebook, and there seems to be quite a lot of them, is something called the Far Gin Project. Now, we had a meet-up a few weeks back now, up at Lutterworth at Mikey Wright's place, a get-together of some of the members. We did some push hands, some exchange, some friendly sparring, that kind of thing. Really good day. I'll put the link to that in the notes below. On the Facebook group, there was a question came up about strength, particularly as it relates to internal martial arts training, where, of course, we're constantly told you shouldn't be using your muscles. I put a clip up of the late Lenny McLean. Now, in case you don't know who he is, he was something of a local character, shall we put it, in the East End, in East London back in the day. Bare knuckle fighter, fought lots of unlicensed boxing fights and was involved in various other things as well. Quite a fearsome man in many ways. He actually later in life turned to acting, and you'll probably recognise him from his role in Lock, Stock and Two Smoking Barrels, the Guy Ritchie gangster film. Anyway, there's a little clip of him being interviewed by a young boxer, and again I'll put a link to that down below. Now, one reason I put that up, because one thing that McLean advises the younger boxer is to be strong. He says some other things as well that didn't go down so well with some of the people in the group, particularly when it came to his mindset and his extremely aggressive approach. And someone said, well, I don't think that's very good advice. Well, I wasn't really putting it up for the advice from that angle, but now you come to mention it, that does lead us into talking about aggression and violence and how we deal with that as martial artists. Because whatever you think of that man's approach and mindset, that is the reality of what you potentially have to face. And just a couple of weeks after that, someone else posted a clip from a YouTube channel called King of the Streets, which is a sort of no holds barred competition where two guys get together and really go at it. Most of them seem to be from rival football firms in Europe, as far as I can tell. But it is brutal stuff. There's very little in the way of rules, and they're really hammering each other. So again, the same issue arises when some martial artists see this kind of thing, they decry it and poo-poo it. Well, you know, fair enough. I get that from a moral standpoint. But again, this is potentially the sort of thing that you may have to face. And people might say, and in fact, some people have said already when I've been talking about this online, yeah, but you know, these days I live in a nice town and I never encounter violence, and what sort of person wants to get involved in all that sort of thing? Well, there's a few things. First of all, if we look at history, let's take this country in particular, and I'm sure the same applies for pretty much everywhere else in the world. the history revolves around violence. We can talk about how England was formed back in the Dark Ages, I guess. Of course, we can talk about 1066 and the Norman Conquest, and subsequent harrying of the North was a nice euphemism for what was, well, essentially genocide. We can talk about a couple of civil wars. We can talk about all sorts of strife within the country. That's within, and then of course we know about the British Empire when we spread out around the world. We know about the colonialism, we know about the exploitation and the slavery and all the rest of it, and of course the exploitation that took part in this country as well in order to build Britain into an industrial nation. And if you think there was no violence involved in that, well, there was lots, because if anyone disagreed with what was going on, they faced severe punishment, sometimes death, sometimes being transported to Australia and so on. So if you look at political English history, you can go back to Wat Tyler, the Charterists, the suffragettes, the poll tax riots, all the rights that we enjoy today. And I have to say, I think people do take for granted, were fought for. And as I said, in some cases, the people fighting for them faced very severe consequences. And it does absolutely baffle me now that there's people around who want to give rights up. They want to strip rights away. Well, I suspect they want to strip rights away for certain types of people, right? But maybe we won't go into that now. So that's the history and political history of the country. But if we look at the social history, then we see a lot of violence in that as well. We can think of criminal activity, of course, and there have been various types of gangs around since the year dot. And we can think also of the sort of the tribal element, if you like, because let's be honest, most of that kind of violence is perpetrated on and by young men. There seems to be a stage in men growing up. Well, sometimes they don't, sometimes they stay at that stage. But when you're young, you might associate with a particular football team or a particular type of music or a particular type of politics, or it might just be something as simple as we live in this street, you live in that street. Maybe it starts at school. You know, the end of term was always a thing. The other school are going to come down and there's going to be a fight. So that seems to be very much part of English culture as well. And of course, there's the eternal cry of the older generation, oh, it's so much worse now than it used to be. The golden age always seems to be about 50 years ago. I saw someone recently saying, we need to get back to the 1970s. It was so much better then. I was around in the 70s. I was a teenager in the 70s. It wasn't much better then. In fact, as far as violence goes concerning young people, barring the knife issues that I know we have at the moment, aside from that, I would say there's a lot less violence from young people these days than there was in the 70s. I see very little football violence. I don't see groups of people going down to the seaside on a bank holiday and having fights on the beach anymore, that kind of thing. So things do change. And I think the idea of the golden age being 50 years ago, well, you can go back to Socrates, right? You can go back to the ancient Greeks when people were saying exactly the same thing. These kids today, no respect, they're aggressive, they're rude, they're violent. Again, that's maybe just human nature. So we might think that's okay, social violence, you know, we can relax, we can stay away from that now. You don't have to go out of your house now. You can just switch on the telly, you can stream, whatever you like. I would challenge you to look at any film outside of maybe some rom-coms or those Hallmark movies. See if you can find any film, particularly American ones, that doesn't have someone getting shot in it at some point. I think you struggle, to be honest. If you look at the streaming services, it seems like every other film is, they killed his family, now he's out for revenge, former special forces something or other. Or there's action movies, drama movies, there's a lot of crime stuff. We even have series where the serial killer is the hero, that kind of thing. And we were even watching a series just recently that was billed as a comedy drama, and every episode you have people getting shot, beaten with baseball bats, people having their throats cut, all in extremely graphic detail. So violence would seem to form a major part of our entertainment. Of course, we don't have to watch TV or films, we can play video games, right? Where do we start? Where do we start? And don't get me wrong, I'm not a Mary Whitehouse or anything like that. I enjoy all these things as much as everyone else. In fact, one of my hobbies that comes off of my interest in military history is tabletop wargaming, where we recreate certain battles in miniature from the past. So again, that's a hobby that revolves around violence. Let's get back to martial arts then, because martial arts obviously grew out of a need to train people up to protect their communities. At least that's one side of it. And I think, again, going back to any village, tribe, state, area, country, whatever it is, there's a history of either you're trying to protect what you've got, your people and resources, or you're trying to grab someone else's, which often resulted in violence. So if we take at the moment that martial arts grew out of a need to protect, within that, of course, comes the idea, the perhaps almost certainty, that in doing that you have to inflict violence on another person. Now, if you're a professional, that could be military or LEO, or even doing something like working the door, that's something you have to square away in your head from day one. It's not the sort of thing you want to get into, then suddenly find yourself in a position where, oh, I've actually got to try and restrain this person and do something to them, and they're going to resist, so I'm going to have to apply some sort of force. That's not the time to discover that. This, of course, is what your martial arts training is for, or one of the things it's for, because there are as many reasons to practice martial arts as there are people practicing them. So, of course, we practice martial arts perhaps for fighting, for self-defense, for combatives, but there's also health and fitness benefits. There's also an interest in other cultures. Some people like wearing certain types of clothes, maybe learning old style weapons, all that kind of thing. There's a social aspect. So all these things are valid reasons for practicing martial arts. But what gets me, and again, I know it's the age of the internet and all the rest of it, is when people have one interest, but they come out of their lane, if you like, and they're going to impose their view or insist on sharing their view with someone with another interest. Well, the internet is particularly bad for this, of course, because you're detached from the person. But I've always found 99% when you get together with other martial artists, everyone is respectful, everyone is friendly, everyone is willing to exchange and share. Of course, very different atmosphere online where people, well, sometimes they start insulting and get even more insulting. And there is a subset of martial artists who seem to decry anything that involves any type of force or effort or, heaven forbid, strength or anything else. Now, I came up pretty much in the internal arts. I did a little bit of boxing and judo as a kid. By the way, I was interviewed by an old mate of mine, Mike Graves, a little while back. We spoke a lot about my background and how I came through martial arts. I'll put the link to that down below as well. But really, I've come up through internal arts, Chinese internal arts, and into Systema, which has the capacity to be very soft, of course, very soft. Softer, I'd even say, than the Tai Chi. But one thing I'd say about, well, all the teachers I've met, and certainly my main teachers, Mikhail and Vladimir, they're both incredibly strong as well. And yet, they apply that strength in a very soft and intelligent way. So we have this dichotomy in martial arts of developing strength, but at the same time working to be very soft and relaxed. This is very important for a couple of reasons. One, it's good for our health. If we practice these movements in such a way, it's very good for all aspects of our health. And particularly when we come to mental health. Because imagine being in a situation, well, let's just take that finger break, for example, where you knowingly and purposefully break someone's fingers. How does that make you feel? I would suggest that unless there's something a bit skew-whiff up here, that would make you feel pretty bad. Because we all have this inbuilt feeling or knowledge or morality. whatever you want to call it, that hurting people is not nice. Most of us have some sense of empathy. So the question then comes that you have to ask yourself in terms of violence, to what level am I able to go in order to, survive a confrontation, or more importantly, end a confrontation as quickly and efficiently as possible? And if you look at pretty much any martial art, they're full of movements to break arms and twist necks and poke eyes and grab parts and rip them off, all this sort of fearsome stuff. So you can't get away from that if you practice martial arts, that what you're training for is to develop the ability to hurt people. Now, of course, with martial arts, often you get what we might call a balance inside. That could be a philosophy or a religion or cultural aspects, or in the case of combat sports, there are rules, there's a sense of fair play and everything else. But at some point you have to acknowledge that what you are training for is potentially to hurt people. And of course, bound within that, you've got moralistic framework. There's also legal framework as well to take into consideration. There are also consequences to think about as well. Consequences for the other person and consequences for yourself. So to me, how you approach that understanding of dealing with violence is very important. In Systema, of course, there are a ton of ways we do that, mostly revolving around the breathing, how we regulate our nervous system, how we react to sudden spikes in the nervous system, how we deal with fight or flight, being startled, all those sort of things. And we work a gradual progression of, I guess, what you might call like fear inoculation. So you can start quite basic and you can build up and up in intensity. And what we've found through that is that people cope very well in dangerous situations. Sometimes fights, but more often even simple things like near misses in cars, almost a car accident or actual car accidents and similar types of situation. So that to me signifies that this is a practical and useful and healthy approach, moving away a bit from some of the things I did earlier, which were very much about developing this predator or animal or aggressive mindset, which has its place. Everything has its place. But I think you've got to find something that suits you best, and most importantly, doesn't damage your health, either physically or your mental health. And in fact, helping people with those kind of issues, whether they're veterans or whether, as I had recently, I spent a day with Bedfordshire Police. It was a day for people who are suffering from various stress-related issues. It was helping them to manage that and deal with that and cope with it. So, if you're doing martial arts, you have to understand and accept there is an element of violence within that. That might not be such an important thing for you, which is fine. Please don't then lecture people who might have to face violence on a daily basis sometimes as part of their job or as just part of their life situation. Because, it's great to say, oh, what sort of person gets into fights every day? Well, some areas are just like that, and with the best will in the world, you can find yourself in difficult situations. If that is your interest, then, as I say, think about how you approach that question of doing violence to another person. Think about how you can develop your skills in order to minimize damage that you do. The best thing, of course, is there's no physical confrontation at all. You can talk your way out and all the rest of it. If you have to work physically against someone, can you develop ways of doing that where you might hurt them a bit? Like if you want to break someone's structure or relax them a bit, you can punch. You can give someone a dead leg, right? It will help collapse their structure. You may be able to take them down and then restrain them, but you're not really damaging them. But that takes skill and that takes practice to develop. If you're thinking, well, it's all right, I've got a great punch, all I need is that punch, then that's a bit like the guy whose only tool is a hammer and every problem becomes a nail. And, you know, I think in terms of does martial arts glorify violence, there is an element of that we have to recognise, because we all watch kung fu films. We like to see the bad guys get beaten, the plucky underdog comes through. I think in Chinese arts there's a cultural element of that as well, where I remember like the old kung fu films, the typical bad guy was a big muscle-bound Westerner, all that kind of stuff. So, you know, that's okay as well, but we have to recognise that as fantasy, and just the fact that you've trained in something doesn't necessarily mean, if you've not worked with it, doesn't mean you're going to be able to cope with raw aggression and violence if it suddenly hits you in the face. And in fact, I've tested this out. Of course I have. I mean, within our training is one thing, you know, but there people sort of expect it a little bit. But I've tried it in other situations where you'll have a group of people and the movement is all, you know, going very nice. There's a lovely flow. There's some good techniques going on. And then suddenly you come into this sort of thing and immediately that flow goes. It drops because there's this sudden shock, the nervous system spikes and everything sort of freezes. So if that side of things is something you are interested in, you have to learn how to deal with even just that verbal aggression. Nothing physical has happened yet, but that presence and that verbal aggression can be very overwhelming. Those are some of my thoughts then. I'll be very interested to hear what people think on this. Any sensible comments, questions and suggestions would be most welcome. I think we do have to recognise that there is a part of us, or there's a part of many of us, that does enjoy violence. Otherwise we wouldn't watch all these films. We wouldn't get that buzz when the good guy comes out on top, he gets his revenge, all that sort of thing. I think we have to recognise that element in ourselves, you know, and there's nothing wrong with that. That's part of being a human being. Of course, the important thing is what we do with that and how we channel it. And as we know, of course, even the most noble aims can be subverted into, well, all sorts of terrible things. And sadly, you know, we only have to watch the news today to see things that are still going on around the world. So yeah, I'll be interested to hear your thoughts. Please do like, share and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. And of course, if you want to get access to all that instructional content we're putting out at the moment, then just click that join button below for details of the member channel. That's it for this time. Take care.